Welcome to another edition of Art Brunch, everybody. Glad you're here. We are beginning a new series, The Art of Wisdom. And I decided on this series after foolishly, or perhaps wisely, I don't know, taking in a variety of news sources to get a sense of the state of the country and the world. And frankly, I came away from that experience depressed. I came away rather pessimistic. I don't like either one of those states. What became clear to me is there is a dearth of wisdom among a significant portion of the population. You agree? Shifting attitudes about whether to support Ukraine in their war with Russia. The complexity and many moral dilemmas of the Israel-Hamas conflict. There is moral confusion on college campuses, woke-inspired censorship, the shutting down of all debate, and the character assassination of cancel culture, not to mention rise of anti-Semitism. And of course, people discounting the science around global warming. That's bewildering to me. And then, of course, in the United States, there are still conspiracy theorists about the January 6th attack on democracy. And there is a growing acceptance of authoritarianism, which in my eyes is a direct existential threat to our democracy. The very same language used by Hitler is seeing a revival in our political rhetoric as well. Now, I apologize for my language here, but what the hell is going on? This is the 21st century, is it not? Shouldn't we have matured beyond such historical follies? Well, I don't want to automatically assume that my perspective on these issues is correct. So I want to review again the greatest works of wisdom our world has produced and see if it may not aid me and perhaps you in understanding better ourselves and our world. I also hope, and this is quite ambitious, that once finished, that we will not hoard our discoveries, but share them with enthusiasm. Yes, what this means is my ultimate hope is that we will become evangelists for wisdom, because this world desperately needs it. What has become clear to me over the years is that the answers to the ethical, the moral questions in our time are found in our collective wisdom. Now, a few sources have guided my initial approach in this series. The Galilean said, "Do not judge so that you may not be judged. First, take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye." And then the bottom quote is from the fifth habit of Steven Covey's great text, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Seek first to understand, then to be understood. This new series will go basically in chronological order of our wisdom teachers. And we begin with the wisdom of the Hebrews, and naturally from the earliest recorded quest for wisdom, the story of Adam, Eve, and the serpent. But before we go there, in the earliest traditions of the Near East, the gods sought to control humans, enslave humans to work for their benefit. That is why we find in many ancient myths stories of humans as caretakers of the gardens that serve the gods. In these myths, the worst sin a person could commit was hubris, trying to be like the gods rather than a slave to them. Now, in order to control humans, the gods sought to prevent us from acquiring their knowledge. This is the backdrop for the story of Adam and Eve. Now, the Hebrews altered the ancient story to make for a more positive relationship between humans and God. Adam and Eve are placed in a garden of God's making to take care of it, yes, but they are also allowed to enjoy the fruits of the garden, with the one exception, of course, of the tree of knowledge, divine knowledge, whose fruit brings wisdom. We all know what happens. A serpent convinces Eve, who convinces Adam that the forbidden fruit will actually make them as wise as the gods. And so they naturally partake of it. Why do they do this after being told not to? Because they are wicked and evil and full of pride? Is that the reason? That's definitely how some have interpreted this story. But that's not the way I interpret it. The obvious truth is that we all have a natural inclination towards gaining knowledge, the greatest knowledge possible. We can't help ourselves. It's in the DNA of being human. Well, it is and it isn't, actually. It's obvious that sometimes we prefer ignorance. Isn't that so? Adam and Eve did not prefer ignorance. But why do some of us prefer ignorance over wisdom? Just hold that question in mind as we move along in this series. Why do some prefer ignorance to wisdom? The story of Adam and Eve and the serpent can be read on multiple levels. Now, on the literal level, the clear lesson is that we should obey the commands of God and not question them, and thus live like children forever in his garden of delights. I think all of us are beyond such a simplistic understanding. The call of the serpent, in contrast to a literal interpretation, is a call to independence, self-consciousness, individuality, and freedom to explore the world to gain ever more wisdom. However, this autonomy, the call to exploration, is bittersweet. The danger, you see, is that the wisdom we gain will indeed lead to hubris and too great of an ego and too little use of that wisdom to serve the rest of humanity. That is the danger. With ego dominance, we are cut off from our fellow human beings and from our spiritual source. In other words, we cut ourselves off from ever returning to Eden as more enlightened people. You see, the light offered by the fruit of knowledge can cast shadows as well. Think of all the spiritual gurus who have exploited and abused their flock. Implicit in the call out of the garden is the hope of returning one day to integrate the hard-fought wisdom we acquired in life with a spiritual reunion with divinity, with our source. But if we fail to use our wisdom in a spirit of humility and in service to humanity, we cut ourselves off from the spiritual life that we had in Eden and that we could have again, but to a greater degree. The path back to Eden is thus a journey of redemption, not of regression. The very wisdom that brought us out of the garden, where we, quote unquote, escaped a union with our source based on ignorance and naivete, and which brought us into the physical world of duality, is simultaneously the very path back to Eden, just in a more spiritually mature state. And that is why the serpent that Moses lifted up in the wilderness and which Christ is compared to in the Gospel of John are symbols of salvation, not death. Because the call of the serpent in Eden was a call to our redemption, not our death, when we interpret it in a non-literal way. From naive innocence in Eden to the gnosis of experience in the physical world and on to a higher spiritual enlightenment back in Eden. This is the journey of spiritual redemption, the cycle of a spiritual life in the earliest Jewish traditions. Now, it is the second phase, the realm of earthly experience, where wisdom is forged, that it will be the subject of our current series. The bulk of the Hebrew tradition of wisdom is attributed to Solomon. The most famous work attributed to him, well, perhaps the most famous, is Proverbs. This work is often described as a collection of practical wisdom that we can readily apply to our lives. Here is how that book begins. It immediately sets out its purpose. Here's how it begins. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, for learning about wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight, for gaining instruction in wise dealing, righteousness, justice, and equity, to teach shrewdness to the simple, knowledge and prudence to the young. Let the wise too hear and gain in learning, and the discerning acquire skill to understand a proverb and a figure, the words of the wise and their riddles. Now, the Hebrew word for wisdom in this book is a feminine word, chokmah. So in the book of Proverbs, our teacher turns out to be Lady Wisdom. We can think of Lady Wisdom then as the feminine aspect of God. The very next verses are, "Hear, my child, your father's instruction, and do not reject your mother's teaching, for they are a fair garland for your head and pendants for your neck." The thrust of this prologue is to beckon us to approach wisdom with the humble spirit, like that of a child thirsty for knowledge. So we must first recognize our own ignorance and limited perspective. Now, the opening chapter of Proverbs ends like this. Wisdom cries out in the street. In the square, she raises her voice. At the busiest corner, she cries out. At the entrance of the city gates, she speaks. How long, O simple ones, will you love being simple? How long will scoffers delight in their scoffing, and fools hate knowledge? This admonition is a clear warning, at least in my eyes, about our current political discourse and the close-minded ideologies informing that discourse. What do you think? Well, now on to some examples of Proverbs in the meat of the book. I'll briefly pause after each one to allow you to apply them to your own circumstance. Some of them will seem straightforward, but others will seem rather enigmatic. Here we go. Don't rebuke a mocker, or he will hate you. Rebuke the wise, and he will love you. A gentle answer turns away anger, but a harsh word stirs up wrath. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for a difficult time. A joyful heart is good medicine, but a broken spirit dries up the bones. Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruit. Some of these are indeed a bit strange and may take greater reflection in order to understand them. Iron sharpens iron as one person sharpens another. I've certainly found that last one to be true in relation to our community in Art Brunch. Well, so far we have received what we might call folksy wisdom. Some of it seems like common sense, statements we can all nod our head to. But Proverbs was almost not accepted into the canon. Why was that? Because at times it seems to contradict itself and blatantly contradict itself. For example, do not answer fools according to their folly, lest you be a fool yourself. But the very next verse, answer fools according to their folly, lest they be wise in their own eyes. And then these two verses, the wicked accepts a bribe in secret to pervert the ways of justice. A gift in secret averts anger, and a concealed bribe strong wrath. Then how about these? Should a person drink alcohol or use other intoxicants? Proverbs 20, verse 1 says, wine is a mocker, strong drink a brawler, and whoever is led astray by it is not wise. And then another verse, do not look at wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup and goes down smoothly. In the end, it bites like a serpent and stings like an adder. But then there is this proverb, give strong drink to the one who is perishing, and wine to those in bitter distress. Let them drink and forget their poverty and remember their misery no more. Well, how do you feel about that last one? Let's look at some more seemingly contradictory proverbs. This relating to wealth. A rich man's wealth is his strong city. The poverty of the poor is their ruin. But then there is this verse. Do not toil to acquire wealth. Be discerning enough to desist. When your eyes light on it, it is gone, for suddenly it sprouts wings, flying like an eagle toward heaven. Well, in light of those two verses, what should be our attitudes towards wealth? And how close of a relationship should we have with our neighbors? Let your foot be seldom in your neighbor's house, lest he have his fill of you and hate you. Do not forsake your friend and your father's friend, and do not go to your brother's house in the day of your calamity. Better is a neighbor who is near than a brother who is far away. And then this one, whoever blesses his neighbor with a loud voice, rising early in the morning, will be counted as cursing. That's a strange one. Well, what are the lessons we can learn from such enigmatic teaching? Well, I think for one, that life is not a journey of extreme clarity, where either or views of truth and ethical living prevail. Life instead is often a perilous, unclear journey, misty, a place of both and, where discernment and appreciation of nuance are the critical skills to possess. In other words, life itself is not a mathematical equation, but a form of art. Well, now from pragmatic wisdom, we expand to philosophical wisdom. Even though the book of Ecclesiastes is also attributed to Solomon, it seems at times to take a cynical view of much of the wisdom in Proverbs. It was almost certainly written down no earlier than the 5th century BCE, so well after Solomon lived. In Proverbs, life is not random, but governed by cause and effect. If we act wisely, we can expect a positive outcome. Not so in the book of Ecclesiastes. Here is how the book begins. The words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. Or quite a different tone than what we find in Proverbs. The book of Ecclesiastes appears to have been written by a pessimist under the influence of Greek skepticism. At times, it almost seems to mock the wisdom we encounter in Proverbs. Now, the word translated as meaningless is the Hebrew word havel, which literally means vapor or breath. So for me, it's unfortunate that translators chose meaningless. That seems a little too harsh of a translation for havel. This word havel is repeated throughout the book, and it reflects the idea that life is transient, and all that is in this world is transient too. Poof, and it is gone. But it also carries the sense that life is a mystery, a mist, smoke that we struggle to see through. So at least for me, the teacher is not claiming that life has no meaning, but that the meaning of life is unclear. Several verses later, the author, supposedly Solomon, states, I, the teacher, was king over Israel and Jerusalem. I applied my mind to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under the heavens. What a heavy burden God has laid on humankind. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. What is crooked cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. I said to myself, look, I have increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I have experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. Then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom and also of madness and folly. But I learned that this too is a chasing after the wind. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. Well, what are we to make of such a pessimistic outlook? What's the point of wisdom if it just leads to suffering? Well, I think we all understand that its corollary, ignorance is bliss, is indeed true on one level. And that is why so many live in willful ignorance. That is why so many choose news sources that simply confirm what they already believe. Heaven forbid we expose ourselves to new information that may challenge our worldview and expose our lack of knowledge and understanding. Now, towards the end of the book, we finally get some perspective on this idea of existence as like a vapor, like breath. Just as you do not know how the breath comes to the bones in the mother's womb, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything. In the morning sow your seed, and at evening do not let your hands be idle. For you do not know which will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good. Light is sweet, and it is pleasant for the eyes to see the sun. Even those who live many years should rejoice in them all, yet let them remember that the days of darkness will be many. All that comes is vanity. Banish anxiety from your mind and put away pain from your body. For youth and the dawn of life are vanity. Well, so we learn that even though life is fleeting and it isn't always fair, we should still act with the wisdom of the Proverbs, because life does often benefit those who act wisely. Not all of the time, but generally so. And because life is like a fleeting breath, we should also enjoy this life while we can. Friends, in the Hebrew tradition of wisdom, there are no guarantees in life. Certainty is an illusion. The best response then is to still live the right way and yet accept what life brings, fair or unfair, and enjoy it while we can. About the book of Ecclesiastes, the American novelist Thomas Wolfe wrote, "Of all I have ever seen or learned, Ecclesiastes seems to me the noblest, the wisest, and the most powerful expression of man's life upon this earth, and also the highest flower of poetry, eloquence, and truth. I am not given to dogmatic judgments in the matter of literary creation, but if I had to make one, I could say that Ecclesiastes is the greatest single piece of writing I have ever known, and the wisdom expressed in it the most lasting and profound." Well, do you agree with Wolfe? Or do you find his praise a bit exaggerated? I suppose to answer that, we would need to read the book in its entirety and perhaps multiple times. So I invite you to do that. One thing is certain. We learn from the Hebrew wisdom tradition that life is complex. This tradition calls us out of childish thinking, calls us out of naive innocence, and into the world of lived experience to discover wisdom, no matter how confusing or even painful the task may be at times. Yes, because life can be an enigma, there is always the temptation towards cynicism. But despite this, we should still live by a code of conduct, find moral clarity where we can find it, and always remain humble. For what we may be certain of may turn out in the end to be as transient as vapor.